I stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of betrayal crashing down on me like a tidal wave. My heart raced as I replayed the words I had overheard, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. My wife, the woman I had vowed to love and cherish, had betrayed me with my father's business partner, a man I had trusted. The anger surged within me, igniting a fire I never knew existed. I had to act, to make them pay for the pain they had caused. It all started with a casual dinner invitation. My father had been excited about the partnership, the potential for growth, and the financial security it promised. The night was supposed to be filled with discussions about strategy, future plans, and dreams that could finally become a reality. I had arrived at the restaurant early, eager to support my father and meet his partner, Richard. But before I could even sit down, I caught a glimpse of her, my wife, Sarah. She was laughing, her head thrown back, looking more vibrant than I had seen her in months. But it wasn't the laughter that caught my attention. It was the way she leaned in closer to Richard. Their chemistry palpable, the air around them charged with something I couldn't quite place. I watched as they exchanged glances and whispers, my heart sinking. There was a familiarity between them that felt wrong. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that I was being paranoid, that this was just business. But as the night progressed, I couldn't help but notice the little things. The way she touched his arm, the way he looked at her with a smirk that made my blood boil. I felt like a ghost in my own life, invisible and powerless as I witnessed the unraveling of my marriage right before my eyes. Then it happened. I overheard them just a few steps away from the table. Their voices were low, but the words were clear. "We can't keep doing this," Sarah said, her voice tinged with guilt. "What if he finds out?" Richard responded with a chuckle. "He won't. Just think about the money, the future. We're unstoppable." In that moment, the world around me faded into nothingness. I was no longer a husband but a man betrayed, and the foundation of my life crumbled beneath me. I stormed out of the restaurant, my hands clenched into fists, my mind racing with disbelief. How could she do this to me? How could she betray our vows, our family, with a man who should have been an ally? The betrayal felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I wanted to scream, to confront them both, but a part of me knew that I needed to think this through. I needed to understand the depths of their treachery before I acted. As I drove home, the streets blurred past me just as my thoughts spiraled into chaos. I felt like a puppet with its strings cut, aimlessly drifting through life. The betrayal was not just against me, it was against my father, our family legacy. Richard was not just my wife's lover, he was a man who stood to gain everything from my father's trust and my own oblivion. The realization struck me hard. This was not just about love. It was about power, money, and the ruthless game of business. My heart raced with a mix of pain and anger, but as I sat in the driveway, I began to feel something else, a spark of determination. They had crossed a line, and I wouldn't let them get away with it. I would make them pay for what they had done, not just for my sake, but for my father and everything he had built. Revenge was a dish best served cold, and I was ready to plan my course of action. The thought of how to ruin their deal began to take root in my mind. I needed to gather information, to expose their deceit, and ensure that my father's trust was shattered along with their illicit affair. No longer would I be the victim. I would be the architect of their downfall. The anger that had consumed me morphed into a cold resolve, and I knew that I had to act swiftly and carefully. As I sat in the stillness of my car, I began to reflect on my relationship with Sarah and the dynamics of our lives before the betrayal shattered everything. We had been married for 5 years, and while it hadn't always been perfect, I thought we had built a solid foundation. We met in college, where we shared late-night study sessions that turned into long conversations about our dreams and aspirations. She was bright, ambitious, and had a charm that could light up any room. I fell for her hard, and when I asked her to marry me, it felt like the most natural decision in the world. But over the years, the pressures of adult life began to creep in. I was working tirelessly at my father's company, trying to prove myself and carve out my own identity in a shadow that often felt suffocating. My father had high expectations, and I was determined to meet them. Meanwhile, Sarah's own career ambitions were taking off, and she was increasingly preoccupied with her work. We had both become so absorbed in our separate worlds that we had failed to nurture our relationship. I had noticed her growing distant, but I chalked it up to stress and the demands of our careers. On the other hand, Richard had been a constant presence in our lives, a man I had looked up to as my father's trusted confidant. He was charismatic and successful, often inviting us to lavish parties and events that showcased his wealth and connections. I admired him, even considered him a mentor in many ways. The thought that he could betray my trust in such a profound way was mind-boggling. I had often seen him as a father figure, someone to guide me through the intricacies of business and life. How could he take advantage of my wife? Looking back, there had been signs, moments that I brushed off as nothing. The late-night meetings that Sarah had with Richard, the way they seemed to share inside jokes, and the glances that lingered a moment too long. I had been blind to the reality of their relationship, too consumed with my own insecurities and the pressure to succeed. It was all too easy to ignore the red flags when you were busy trying to prove yourself. I began to think about the deal Richard was brokering with my father. It was a massive investment that could elevate our family business to new heights, something my father had been dreaming of for years. But now, the thought of their partnership felt tainted. I had to find a way to dismantle it. The stakes were high. If I failed, it would not only ruin my relationship with Sarah, but would also have repercussions for my father's legacy. I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. I needed to be strategic. I spent the next few days gathering information. I reached out to a few acquaintances in the industry, asking discreet questions about Richard's reputation and the specifics of the deal. I learned that Richard had a history of cutting corners and manipulating situations to his advantage. My anger began to transform into a plan. I would expose him for who he really was, not just to my father, but to everyone who mattered in the business community. The more I delved into Richard's dealings, the more I uncovered. There were whispers of shady practices, questionable investments that had left others in the dust. I realized that Richard was not the invincible figure I had imagined. He was vulnerable, a man who had built his empire on shaky ground. This knowledge gave me a sense of power, a feeling that I could take control of my life again. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a player in this dangerous game. But as I plotted my revenge, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that loomed over me. I was about to destroy not just Richard, but my wife and my father as well. Would my actions be justified? Would this truly bring me the closure I craved, or would it only deepen the wounds? I wrestled with these questions while I mapped out my plan, knowing that I was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. The thought of confronting Sarah weighed heavily on me. I knew that revealing my knowledge of her affair would shatter any remnants of trust we had left. But I also understood that I couldn't let her think there would be no consequences for her actions. I needed her to feel the weight of what she had done to understand the depths of her betrayal. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about making her realize the gravity of her choices. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. I would gather the evidence I needed, then confront them both. I would expose Richard to my father, unravel their business deal, and watch as their world crumbled around them. It was a dark path I was choosing, but in that moment it felt like the only way to reclaim my life and my dignity. The days that followed felt like a blur of plotting and scheming. I became a man on a mission, meticulously gathering evidence to lay bare Richard's deceit. I spent countless hours in front of my computer, combing through public records, financial statements, and industry news. The more I dug, the more dirt I found, misleading reports, missed deadlines, and even whispers of shady deals that hinted at Richard's unscrupulous nature. It was as if I was peeling back layers of deceit to expose the rotting core of a man I had once admired. I found a few key players who were willing to talk, people who had been burned by Richard's business practices. They recounted stories of how he had manipulated situations to benefit himself, leaving others in the dust. It felt good to have allies, even if they were strangers. They fueled my anger and resolve, pushing me further down this dark path. I started to compile a dossier, a collection of evidence that would be damning enough to not only ruin Richard's reputation, but also threaten his partnership with my father. But as I worked tirelessly to execute my plan, I couldn't shake the nagging guilt that accompanied each step I took. I was becoming the very thing I despised, a man consumed by revenge. I began to question my motivations. Was I really doing this for my father and the family business, or was this purely about my wounded pride? I had to remind myself of the betrayal that had set this all in motion. It was Sarah's infidelity that had ignited this fire within me, and I couldn't allow myself to forget that. The confrontation with Sarah loomed over me like a storm cloud. I knew I had to face her, to lay out the evidence of her betrayal and make her understand the repercussions of her actions. But every time I thought about it, a part of me hesitated. I loved her despite everything. I still loved her. We had built a life together, shared dreams, and even a home. The thought of tearing that apart was gut-wrenching. But how could I trust her again after what she had done? The emotional turmoil was exhausting, and I found myself oscillating between rage and heartbreak. As I prepared for the confrontation, I decided to set a date. I would invite her to dinner, a seemingly normal evening that would mask the storm I was about to unleash. I planned to present her with the evidence, to show her that I knew everything. The idea of confronting her in our home felt both terrifying and necessary. I needed her to understand that her actions had consequences, not just for her but for our entire family. The night arrived, and I set the table with a careful precision, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy. I cooked her favorite meal, a dish I had perfected over the years, hopping to create an atmosphere that felt familiar and safe. But beneath the surface, my heart raced with anticipation and dread. I knew this dinner would change everything. When Sarah walked through the door, she greeted me with a smile that momentarily disarmed me. "Hey, babe, what's the occasion?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with warmth. I forced a smile back, but inside I was a tempest of emotions. "Just wanted to do something special," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. We sat down to eat, and I watched her as she savored the meal, oblivious to the storm brewing in my heart. The conversation flowed easily at first, reminiscing about our early days together, sharing laughter over inside jokes. But as the evening progressed, I felt the weight of the truth pressing down on me, urging me to act. Finally, after the last bite had been consumed, I took a deep breath and steeled myself. "Sarah," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "there's something we need to talk about." Her expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "What is it?" I reached for the folder I had prepared, my hands shaking as I placed it on the table between us. "I know about you and Richard," I said, my voice steadying as I watched her face drain of color. "I know everything." Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment I saw a flicker of guilt flash across her face. "What do you mean?" she stammered, but I wasn't in the mood for games. I opened the folder, revealing the evidence I had gathered, the messages, the financial discrepancies, and the testimonies from those who had been wronged by Richard. "Here," I said, my voice cold. "This is what I've found." "You think I wouldn't notice? You think I wouldn't know?" I threw the folder down in front of her, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. She looked at the papers, then back at me, her expression shifting from shock to denial. "This isn't what you think. I can explain." "Explain what, Sarah? How you let him into our lives, how you betrayed me with a man I trusted." The anger surged within me again, and I felt the walls I had built around my heart begin to crumble. Tears filled her eyes as she struggled to find the words. "I never meant for it to happen. It was a mistake. I love you. Do you?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You love me, yet you chose to sleep with my father's business partner. You tore apart our marriage for what? A fleeting moment of excitement. I can't even look at you right now." The reality of the situation settled in, and I felt a hollow ache in my chest. I had wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, but now that I was here, it felt like I was the one being crushed under the weight of betrayal. The confrontation had become a battlefield, and I was both the soldier and the casualty. I had wanted to expose her, to make her understand, but now all I felt was the impending sense of loss. I had to push through this emotional turmoil. I couldn't let her see my weakness. I had a plan to execute, and I had to stay focused. As I looked at her, I realized that this was just the beginning. The fallout from this confrontation would set off a chain reaction, one that would ultimately lead to the destruction of Richard and the unraveling of his partnership with my father. I was ready to carry out my plan, no matter the cost. The confrontation with Sarah left me in a whirlwind of emotions, but I had to push those feelings aside. I had a mission to complete, and I couldn't afford to falter now. The next step was to execute my plan against Richard and ensure that the deal he was brokering with my father would come crashing down. The first thing I needed to do was gather all the evidence I had compiled and prepare to deliver it to my father. I knew that simply handing him the dossier wouldn't be enough. I had to frame it in a way that highlighted Richard's deceit while still protecting my father's feelings. After all, this was not just business, it was family. I decided to invite my father over for dinner. It would be a casual evening, just the two of us, away from the distractions of the office. I wanted a setting that allowed for an open and honest conversation. As I prepared for the dinner, I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. I knew I was about to shatter my father's trust in a man he considered a partner. But I reminded myself that this was necessary for the greater good of our family business. When my father arrived, he seemed in good spirits, chatting about work and the success of the upcoming deal with Richard. I listened, nodding along, all the while feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I could see how excited he was about the partnership, and it made the task ahead feel even heavier. After we finished dinner, I suggested we move to the living room, where I had set up a projector. "Dad, there's something I want to show you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Is this about the deal with Richard?" he asked, a hint of concern in his tone. "Yes," I replied, my heart pounding. "I think it's important for you to see this before you move forward." I clicked the projector on, and the screen illuminated with the first slide of my carefully curated presentation. It began with an overview of the deal, highlighting its potential benefits. But as I transitioned to the next slide, my father's excitement began to wane. "Dad, I've been looking into Richard's background, and what I found is troubling," I said, watching his brow furrow as I presented the evidence of Richard's questionable business practices. I detailed the financial discrepancies I had uncovered, the testimonies from those who had been wronged by him, and the emails that hinted at his manipulations. "This can't be true," my father said, shaking his head. "Richard has always been trustworthy. I've known him for years." "I thought so too, Dad. But look at the evidence. He's been playing a game and we're just pawns in it. I know this is hard to believe, but I wouldn't lie to you about something this serious." As I continued to present the information, I could see the disbelief in my father's eyes slowly transform into concern. He flipped through the pages of the dossier, his expression hardening with each revelation. I felt a pang of guilt but pushed it aside. I was doing this for him, for our family. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my father set the dossier down on the table, his face pale. "I need to talk to Richard," he said, his voice low and heavy with disappointment. "Dad, please think this through. If he's capable of this kind of deception, he won't hesitate to manipulate you. We need to be cautious," I urged, desperate to keep him from making a hasty decision that could backfire. "I can't just confront him without proof," he replied, frustration creeping into his tone. "I need to verify this information first." I nodded, understanding the weight of the situation. "I can help you with that. We'll dig deeper together. But for now, let's be careful. We can't let Richard know we're onto him." The conversation shifted to damage control. My father began to discuss ways to protect our business interests while still moving forward with the partnership. It was a delicate balance, but I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that I had planted the seeds of doubt in his mind about Richard. As the evening wrapped up, I felt a mix of triumph and apprehension. I had taken the first major step toward dismantling Richard's empire, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. The fallout from this would be significant, not just for Richard, but for my father and our family as well. The next morning, I reached out to the contacts I had met during my research. I needed to gather more intel on Richard's dealings, especially regarding the current deal with my father. I wanted to ensure that I had all the ammunition I needed to bring him down. As I spoke to various people in the industry, I began to piece together a clearer picture of Richard's shady practices. Each conversation fueled my resolve and solidified my determination to see this through. Days turned into weeks, and I continued to gather evidence, each piece of information building a case against Richard. I learned about a major investor who had pulled out of a previous deal due to Richard's unethical practices. This was the leverage I needed. If I could persuade my father to approach this investor, I could expose Richard for who he truly was. As I put the finishing touches on my plan, I felt a sense of urgency. I needed to move quickly before Richard caught wind of my intentions. I knew he was a cunning man, and he wouldn't take kindly to anyone threatening his empire. I decided to set up a meeting with my father and the investor. It was a risky move, but I felt it was necessary to solidify my case against Richard. I reached out to the investor, who agreed to meet, albeit cautiously. I explained the situation, emphasizing the importance of protecting our family business from Richard's grasp. When the day of the meeting arrived, I felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. This was the moment I had been working toward, the culmination of my plan to dismantle Richard's hold over my father and our business. As we sat in the conference room, I could see the skepticism in the investor's eyes as I presented the evidence. But as I laid out the facts, detailing Richard's history and the potential ramifications of continuing the partnership, I noticed a shift. The investor began to connect the dots, his expression changing from doubt to concern. By the end of the meeting, the investor agreed to pull out of the deal if Richard remained involved. It was a victory, but I knew it was only the beginning. Richard would not go down without a fight, and I had to be prepared for whatever he might throw my way. As I walked out of the meeting, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I had taken significant steps toward dismantling Richard's empire, but I also knew that the repercussions would be far-reaching. I had set in motion a series of events that would change everything, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The thrill of revenge coursed through me, but as I looked back at the path I had chosen, I couldn't help but question the cost. Would it truly bring me the closure I sought, or would it only deepen the wounds I was trying to heal? As the days passed, the consequences of my actions began to unfold in ways I hadn't anticipated. The investor's decision to withdraw from the deal sent shockwaves through my father's company. Richard's reaction was swift and furious. He called an emergency meeting with my father, demanding an explanation for the investor's pullout and accusing my father of sabotaging the partnership. I watched from the sidelines, feeling a mix of satisfaction and dread as I realized I had set off a chain reaction that could lead to chaos. The confrontation between my father and Richard was intense. I could hear their raised voices through the walls of the office, the tension palpable. My father, usually so composed and authoritative, sounded frustrated and cornered. Richard was a master manipulator, and I knew he would try everything in his power to turn this situation around and regain control. I felt a pang of guilt as I thought about my father's trust in Richard, a trust I had now shattered. When the meeting finally ended, I confronted my father in his office. The look on his face told me everything. I had not only ruined Richard's reputation but had also put my father in a difficult position. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice low and strained. "You've destroyed years of work and trust." "Dad, I did this to protect you and the company," I replied, my heart racing. "Richard was never the partner you thought he was. He's been manipulating you, using your trust to further his own agenda. You could have talked to me first," he shouted, his frustration boiling over. "You didn't have to go behind my back like this. You've put everything at risk." I felt the weight of my father's disappointment settle heavily on my shoulders. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you deserved to know the truth before it was too late." "Truth?" he scoffed. "You call this truth? You've created a mess that will take years to clean up. Richard is not just some adversary. He's been a part of our family's business for decades. You've burned bridges, and I don't know if we can recover from this." The reality of my actions hit me hard. I had acted out of anger and betrayal, and now it felt like I had lost not only my wife but also my father's trust. I had wanted revenge, but the fallout was spiraling beyond my control. The very foundation of our family business was at stake, and I was at the center of the storm. As the days turned into weeks, Richard retaliated. He began to spread rumors about our company, sowing seeds of doubt among our clients and partners. He painted me as the villain, the one who had sabotaged a promising partnership out of jealousy and spite. I watched in horror as my father's reputation began to suffer, the whispers of discontent growing louder in the industry. I tried to counteract the damage by reaching out to our clients, explaining the situation and reassuring them of our commitment to integrity and transparency. But it felt like an uphill battle. The trust we had built over the years was crumbling, and I could see the strain it was putting on my father. He was a proud man, and I could sense the frustration and anger simmering beneath the surface. One evening, as we sat in silence at the dinner table, I mustered the courage to speak. "Dad, I know I messed up, but we can still turn this around. We just need to expose Richard for who he really is." My father looked up, his expression weary. "And how do you plan to do that? He's a powerful man and he won't go down without a fight. You've put us in a vulnerable position and I don't know if we can recover." I felt a surge of determination. We have to gather more evidence. If we can show that Richard has been dishonest in his dealings, we can take him down. I've already started reaching out to some contacts who might have information. My father sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know if it's worth the risk, son. We could end up losing everything. But we can't let him win. If we back down now, we're admitting defeat. We have to stand up for ourselves, for the family business." He looked at me, the weight of the situation etched on his face. "I just don't want to see you get hurt. You've already sacrificed so much in this fight." I nodded, understanding his concern, but I was determined. I couldn't let Richard's betrayal go unpunished. I had to see this through, no matter the cost. That night I began to formulate a new plan. I reached out to the contacts I had developed over the past few weeks, seeking any information that could help us build a case against Richard. I was relentless in my pursuit, and as I gathered more evidence, I began to feel a sense of purpose returning. I discovered that Richard had made several questionable investments in recent months, each one riddled with red flags. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report, hoping to present it to my father as a way to regain his trust and show him that I was still fighting for our family. But as I prepared to confront my father again, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my gut. I had wanted to protect my family, but in my quest for revenge, I had put everything at risk. I had hurt the people I loved most, and I was starting to wonder if there was a way to fix what I had broken. The next day, I walked into my father's office, my heart pounding. I laid the report on his desk, my hands trembling. "Dad, I think I've found something that can help us. We can expose Richard's deceit and turn this around." He looked at the report, his expression unreadable. "And what if it backfires? What if he retaliates even harder?" "Then we'll be ready," I replied, my voice steadying. "But we can't just sit back and let him destroy everything we've built. We have to fight back." He sighed, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. "I need some time to think about this." I nodded, knowing that I had to give him space. I had done what I could, the next steps were up to him. But as I left his office, I felt a mix of hope and despair. I had taken significant steps toward exposing Richard, but at what cost? Would my father ever forgive me for the turmoil I had caused? I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The lines had been drawn, and I was ready for the battle that lay ahead. As I waited for my father to process the evidence I had laid before him, I felt a sense of urgency, mixed with an underlying anxiety that gnawed at me. The stakes were high, and I had already caused enough damage. I needed to ensure that my next steps were carefully calculated. I couldn't afford to make another mistake. Days passed, and I watched as my father struggled with the weight of the decision before him. He was a man of integrity, and the thought of taking on Richard weighed heavily on his conscience. I could see the toll it was taking on him. He had lost his appetite, his usual spark dimmed by the stress of the situation. I felt the guilt swell within me, knowing that my actions had led us here. Finally, my father called me into his office one afternoon. The tension in the air was palpable as he gestured for me to sit. "I've reviewed your report," he began, his voice steady but laced with fatigue. "You've done a thorough job, and I can see the potential for a case against Richard, but I need to know that you are prepared for the fallout." "I am," I replied, my heart racing. "I know this will be a fight, but we can't let him ruin us. We need to protect our family and our business." He nodded slowly, weighing my words. "I'm concerned about how this will affect our relationships. In the industry, Richard has connections and he won't go down without a fight. We need to be prepared for anything he might throw our way." "I understand, Dad, but we have to act. If we don't stand up for ourselves, we're only giving him more power," I urged, my determination rising. After a moment of silence, he sighed. "All right, let's move forward. We'll approach the board and present what you found. If we can get their support, we may have a chance to confront Richard publicly." The relief that washed over me was immense, but I also felt the weight of responsibility. This was it, the moment I had been fighting for. I was about to confront the man who had betrayed not just me, but my family. As we prepared for the board meeting, I felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. I had gathered all the evidence, and now it was time to present it to those who had trusted Richard. The meeting was set for the following week, and I spent the days leading up to it rehearsing my presentation, ensuring that I could convey the gravity of the situation. When the day of the meeting arrived, I walked into the conference room, my heart pounding in my chest. The board members filed in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. I took a deep breath, glancing at my father for reassurance. He gave me a nod, and I felt a surge of determination. I began my presentation, laying out the evidence against Richard and detailing the implications of his actions. I could see the doubt and disbelief in some of their faces, but as I continued to present the facts, I noticed a shift. They began to lean in, intrigued by the information I was revealing. "Richard has been dishonest in his dealings," I concluded, my voice steady. "If we allow him to continue this partnership, we risk losing everything we've worked for. We need to take action now before it's too late." The room fell silent as my words hung in the air. I could feel the tension building, and I braced myself for the reactions. One of the board members, a longtime ally of my father, spoke up. "This is serious. We need to investigate further before making any decisions." My father chimed in. "I agree. We should gather more evidence and prepare for a confrontation. We can't let Richard manipulate us any longer." As discussions ensued, I felt a mix of hope and relief. It seemed that the tide was turning in our favor. The board members began to rally behind us, expressing their concerns about Richard and the potential damage he could cause. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. However, I knew that Richard wouldn't take this lying down. I could already envision his retaliation, the way he would twist the narrative to paint himself as the victim. As the meeting concluded, I felt a sense of dread settle in my stomach. This was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Over the next few weeks, we prepared for the confrontation with Richard. We gathered more evidence, reached out to industry contacts, and solidified our case against him. The pressure was mounting, and I felt the weight of my choices bearing down on me. I had wanted revenge, but now I was faced with the reality of what that entailed. The day of the confrontation arrived, and I steeled myself for the inevitable fallout. Richard arrived at the office, a smug expression on his face, clearly unaware of the storm that awaited him. As he stepped into the conference room, I could see the confidence radiating off him, but I was determined to shatter that facade. "Thank you for coming, Richard," my father began, his voice calm but firm. "We need to discuss the future of our partnership." I watched as Richard's demeanor shifted, curiosity replacing his arrogance. He glanced between my father and me, sensing that something was amiss. "We've gathered evidence that suggests you've been dishonest in your dealings," I interjected, my voice steady. "We cannot continue this partnership under such circumstances." Richard's expression turned to one of disbelief. "What are you talking about? This is absurd. You're just trying to sabotage me because of some personal grudge." I took a deep breath, prepared for the fight. "This isn't personal, Richard. This is about protecting our family and our business. We have the evidence to prove your unethical practices, and we will not stand by while you manipulate us. As the confrontation escalated, I felt the adrenaline coursing through me. Richard's attempts to deflect blame only served to strengthen our resolve. We presented our findings, detailing every misstep and deceitful action he had taken. The tide was turning, and I could see the realization dawn on the board members as they connected the dots. In the end, Richard was forced to confront the reality of his actions. He could no longer hide behind his charm and manipulation. The board voted to terminate the partnership, and Richard stormed out, his face flushed with anger. As the dust settled, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. I knew that Richard would not go down without a fight. He would seek revenge in whatever way he could. But I also knew that I had taken a stand for my family, for my father, and for myself. In the days that followed, I faced the consequences of my actions. The fallout from the confrontation rippled through the industry, and I became a target of Richard's wrath. He spread rumors and attempted to undermine my credibility, but I stood firm, bolstered by the support of my father and the board. As I navigated the complexities of our new reality, I began to reflect on what I had learned through this tumultuous journey. Revenge had driven me to take drastic actions, but it had also exposed the fragility of trust and the importance of loyalty. I realized that while I had sought to dismantle Richard's empire, I had also risked losing my own sense of self in the process. In the end, I came to understand that true strength lay not in revenge, but in the ability to rebuild and move forward. I had lost a part of my marriage, and my relationship with my father had been strained, but there was still hope for healing. As I sat down with my father one evening, I took a deep breath and broached the subject of our relationship. "Dad, I know I've made mistakes. I just want you to know that I'm committed to making things right." He looked at me, his eyes filled with understanding. "We all make mistakes, son. What matters is how we learn from them. We'll rebuild together." In that moment, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. I had faced the darkness within myself and emerged with a newfound clarity. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the lessons I had learned and the strength of my family by my side. Ultimately, I had sought revenge, but what I found was a deeper understanding of loyalty, love, and the complexities of the human heart. It was a journey fraught with pain, but it had also opened the door to healing and redemption. And as I looked forward, I knew that I was ready to face the future, no matter what it held.